April 27th, 2011 is a day that lives in weather infamy as one of the worst tornado days in U.S. history. On that day, 173 tornadoes touched down, with 15 of them EF4 or EF5. Hello, I am Pat from Pat's Path Predictor, and welcome to Part 2 of our documentary covering the 2011 super outbreak. In Part 1, we covered the first 2 days of the outbreak, as well as the tornadoes that occurred on the morning of the 27th. In Part 2, we will talk about the tornadoes that destroyed entire towns and would kill hundreds of people. It would also cover some of the most violent tornadoes, and infamous tornadoes that is, to ever hit the United States. Welcome to Part 2 of the 2011 Super Outbreak documentary. Last we left off, on the morning of April 27th, 2011, a line of thunderstorms moved over Mississippi and Alabama and resulted in many tornadoes, some at EF3 strength, touching down. Many believed it would bust the afternoon severe weather to occur later that day.
We see what a lot of people said was that, that morning round of thunderstorms was going to bust the event for the rest of the day. And that the second round of supercells that was expected to form behind that, through Mississippi wasn't going to be as significant.
However, the opposite happened, and that line of storms wore down the cap, which is stable air that prevents severe storm development, to the point where one small spark could ignite the 3,000 to 4,000 joules per kilogram of CAPE that it was containing. In this part, we will talk about both the behind-the-scenes and tornado action April 27th became known for.
But instead what happened was you had a much more significant severe weather outbreak.
To start, we must look at the SPC outlook for April 27th. A high risk was issued for parts of Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. The tornado risk was at 45% within a hatched area, which means there is a 45% risk of EF2 to EF5 tornadoes within 25 miles of a point, which is an extremely high and rare threat.
45% is extremely rare. Like, you'll see a 30% like we saw in the 26th. You'll see that like maybe on average once every 2 or 3 years. We've had years where there have been more in between, but 30% usually, sometimes you'll see more than one in a year, but 30% usually that's on average 2 to 3 years. But 45, that's rare. That's, you only see that once every like 10 years, and it's just as rare for them to verify too as a 45%. That's, same as a 30, a major outbreak of tornadoes, but a particularly high chance of, the long track violent ones.
The hail threat was not any better. It was also a 45% with a hatched area, which means that there is a 45% risk for 2-inch hail or larger to occur within 25 miles of a point. The wind threat was also at 45% in a hatched area, which means that there is a 45% risk of winds of 65 knots or 75 miles per hour within 25 miles of a point. One thing I want to mention also is how wide the 30 and 15% area is, how large it is as well.
This whole event was caused by this huge mid-latitude cyclone that basically affected the entire eastern U.S. with, lots of record-breaking rainfall, severe weather, basically stretching from the southern part of Canada up in Ontario. There was actually an EF0 tornado confirmed from this event that spun up within some thunderstorms up there, all the way down through New York, down through the East Coast, and the worst of it being in the Deep South.
The skew-T values in Montgomery on April 27th absolutely exploded, as by 7 a.m. or 12 UTC, it was only at 0.27 joules per kilogram. 6 hours later, by 1 p.m., it was already at almost 2,400 joules per kilogram, 2367 to be exact. And by 7 p.m., it was at 3,059 joules per kilogram. The Birmingham Cape over there, by contrast, at around the same time, was around 3,400 joules per kilogram. And by the time the storms were expected to be the most intense, it was expected that the Cape would be over 4,000 joules per kilogram.
That's unprecedented. That's really about the upper end of what's possible, honestly, for that time of year. That's really, as bad as it gets.
From the outbreak on April 27th, a total of 173 confirmed tornadoes were reported. However, that is not counting the amount of tornadoes that happened earlier that morning.
I think in total, like between like the max 24 hours of this had like 220 confirmed at some point in those 24. In the
Was it because of the morning storms?
Yeah, I think between the morning storms and then the afternoon ones, because like the timing, if you're looking at Tornado Archive, it won't, like if you put in the 27th, it won't count the ones from the morning because it goes to like 12Z or something.
Okay.
So, but yeah, like from midnight on the 27th to midnight on the 28th, there were like 227 tornadoes. It was something around there.
All right. Of those over 220 tornadoes, 15 of which were rated EF4 and EF5, and some of them were some of the most notorious tornadoes in United States history.
All of the violent tornadoes, EF4 plus, in the entire outbreak occurred on April 27th.
How many EF4s and EF5s were there?
We had 11 EF4s and 4 EF5s.
Of those, we will be going over 6 of the most notorious tornadoes. The first one we are going to be covering is the Philadelphia tornado that was an EF5 and leveled the town of Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Yeah, I believe that was the first EF5 of the outbreak. So that one was particularly notable because it actually scoured the ground out 2 feet deep.
Really? So
Yeah.
basically, just for context, the 1997 Gerald tornado in Texas did this. So we're seeing tornadoes of that strength right now in April 27th.
Yeah, you know, the soil in the deep south is a lot softer because it's wet, but still 2 feet of ground scouring is just crazy.
This monster EF5 tornado formed at 2:30 p.m. and tracked 29 miles until dissipating at 3 p.m. right on the dot. However, in the process, it would destroy Philadelphia, Mississippi, kill 3 people, and it would cause over $1 million of damage. At its peak, the tornado was 205 miles per hour in wind speed, as well as half a mile wide.
It was on the ground for 29 miles, and it killed 3 people when it hit a mobile home and leveled it. So yeah, that was the first EF5 of the outbreak.
The next tornado was the Smithville-Shotsville tornado that hit from Smithville, Mississippi into Shotsville, Alabama. This was an EF5 tornado with 205 mile per hour winds and a 3/4 mile wide tornado at its path. It traveled 37 miles and killed 23 people while completely leveling Smithville.
So yeah, Smithville was a solid EF5. This one formed in the sort of like the northeast corner of Mississippi, almost in Alabama, from this one supercell, and it touched down, you know, southwest of Smithville, and it moved through the town, and it pretty much completely was a direct hit. Pretty much completely leveled the town, almost like Greensburg 2007, and unfortunately 23 people were killed in that tornado. And that one was on the ground for about 37 miles, if I remember correctly, and it did track into Alabama. So yeah, that was a pretty violent tornado. Lots of homes in that town, well-built homes, were completely swept off their foundations, and I believe this was also the tornado that brought down. Actually, what happened with this tornado was it actually threw a pickup truck into the city's water tower and damaged it.
This is that water tower. If you look up closely, there is a massive dent on the top of the water tower from that pickup truck crashing into that tower thanks to the Smithville tornado. It slapped well-built homes.
Yeah, that's how it got the EF5 rating.
Yeah. So essentially, the only way you'd survive is if you were underground at that point. These are only a few images of the damage that occurred in Smithville, Mississippi. As you can see, entire homes are completely slabbed with everything gone except for the concrete foundation right there. That's what causes these tornadoes to get EF5 damage. If you look at the last image, it shows the town almost completely leveled, as well as that path of that pickup truck that hit the water tower. It was actually lofted almost a mile until it landed in another house. The next tornado we are going to talk about is the tornado I like to call the Smithville tornado's brother, as it formed from the same supercell. However, it would prove to be much longer tracked and much more deadly than its predecessor.
This was from the same supercell, and this one was the most violent, the most long track, and the deadliest tornado of the entire outbreak.
This tornado in question is the very infamous Hackleberg tornado from Alabama. It would go 137 miles, the longest track tornado of any of the tornado in the super outbreak, and it would remain in EF5 through most of it. This was a very powerful wedge tornado that tragically killed 72 people, making it the worst tornado casualty-wise throughout the entire super outbreak.
This one touched down right around central Alabama, and it moved northeast up toward the Decatur, Huntsville area, and eventually it crossed into Tennessee. But this one was on the ground in total for 132 miles.
Other than the death rate, there are several other factors that make this tornado very infamous. Number one, this was the largest tornado out of any in the super outbreak. It was over a mile wide, 1.25 mile wide to be exact. It also moved extremely fast. It moved at 70 miles per hour as it was plowing through Alabama and Tennessee. It also was the strongest tornado of any tornado in the super outbreak, reaching a wind speed of 210 miles per hour.
First of those being Hackleberg, where it completely leveled a bunch of well-built homes, a school, and killed 19 people there. Then it hit the town of Phil Campbell, where it killed more people and also completely ripped the pavement off of the roads there, as well as leveling more homes. And the really notable thing about this tornado was it was violent, produced almost continuous EF4, EF5 damage through its entire path, because a lot of tornadoes only get that EF5 rating for a small part of their track, whereas this tornado was EF5 for almost the entire 100 plus miles it was on the ground.
That is insane.
Which is what makes and what's even more insane about that is it was moving 70 miles per hour, so it was going through pretty quickly, and it still managed to cause EF5, EF4 damage for an incredibly long track.
The Hackleberg tornado first touched down at 3:05 p.m. Central Time, and after rapidly intensifying to EF5 strength, it struck Hackleberg and completely leveled the town. It then hit the town of Phil Campbell, and once again, it completely obliterated the town, with EF4 to EF5 damage going on across it. In total, in Phil Campbell, 27 people were tragically killed in this very violent and very powerful tornado. The tornado would continue to move at 70 miles per hour, and it would eventually near the Browns Ferry nuclear power plant in Huntsville.
This tornado has actually been compared a lot to the tri-state tornado, because it was about the similar size. This one was a little over a mile wide, was moving over 70 miles per hour at its peak, which is similar to that tornado. So this is basically considered to be, as of the current day, one of the closest analogs to the tri-state tornado.
However, the most infamous tornado of this super outbreak is just about to come. It is yet to come. This tornado, even at mere mention, brings back many horrible and haunting memories. This tornado that struck two cities within an hour of each other. The tornado I am referring to is the Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado. The tornado so famous that a mere mention of it will immediately see a flurry of reaction.
This is really one of the most notorious tornadoes of the 21st century, and really had a lot of media coverage, a lot of high quality videos of it, due to the fact that it did impact a very heavily populated area, Tuscaloosa and Birmingham. Yeah, this thing touched down southwest of Tuscaloosa by about, let's say, 10 or 20 miles, and it moved through, pretty much right through the town, right through a lot of heavily populated neighborhoods. It passed just to the south of the University of Alabama campus too, where several people actually filmed it from there. Mm-hmm. And it actually did kill several students there when it moved through the surrounding neighborhoods.
The infamous Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado was a high-end EF4 tornado with winds of 190 miles per hour that carved a path of pure destruction from Tuscaloosa County to Jefferson County and beyond. This tornado caused over $2 billion in damage. The cost of it, in retrospect, is just as expensive as some of the tornado outbreaks in the same month. That is how much damage it caused. It also killed 64 people in both Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, not individually, but that's the total death toll.
Lots of people, who lived in that town, lost everything that day. And this one, it was particularly bad because it's not like it spent most of its time going through, the woods like a lot of other tornadoes in this outbreak. Like Philadelphia, even though that was an extremely violent tornado, that one mostly stayed over rural areas. It did unfortunately level a few homes, but whereas this tornado just kept going through heavily populated suburbs, apartments, businesses, all of that, just right in the path of this thing.
This large multi-vortex wedge tornado touched down in rural Greene County, Alabama, which is just outside of Tuscaloosa County. And by 5:10 p.m., 20 minutes after it touched down, it had started to move in the Tuscaloosa-Birmingham suburbs. And from there, it rapidly intensified and caused massive destruction. Anything within its path was either damaged or destroyed. After a video from the local news source at the time showed evidence of this tornado happening, the National Weather Service declared a tornado emergency for Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, Alabama.
And one thing that was really notable about it, like in terms of some of the footage from that tornado, was it had, horizontal vortices extending from the side of it, which is usually a sign of a really violent tornado.
An interesting thing to note about the Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado was that this thing did not peak at one area and then kind of stagnate as some tornadoes would and just slowly weaken. This thing was still an EF3 to EF4 tornado as it was going through Tuscaloosa and as it was going through Birmingham and as it was passing Birmingham all the way until it dissipated.
The thing was with this tornado, it kind of had several peaks. It reached EF4 at several different points. One of them was right as it was going through the middle of Tuscaloosa.
The tornado would then weaken to EF2 as it moved past Tuscaloosa and in between that and Birmingham. However, after that, things got out of hand very fast.
Through just south of the University of Alabama. Then it kind of weakened and became like around EF2 strength in between the cities. Then it grew wide, 1.5 miles wide. Then it went through kind of like the northern suburbs of Birmingham, and it leveled, and then it re-strengthened actually once it got northeast of the city, and it did level an apartment complex or something up there.
This 1.5 mile wide tornado would then move into Birmingham, rapidly intensifying back to EF4 strength, while at the same time it would level infamously an apartment complex. This tornado by itself cost over $2 billion in damage, about as much damage as some of the several outbreaks during April. It also was the most infamous tornado covered, mostly because of how much destruction it caused and the fact that it hit two of Alabama's biggest cities.
Definitely, in terms of the media coverage and the footage from it, it's definitely the most viewed. Because the Hackleberg tornado was the strongest, deadliest, most long tracked, but a lot of the videos of it aren't high quality, and I personally think it was the scariest tornado by far of the outbreak. But yeah, the Tuscaloosa one is just so much more notorious because it went through such a heavily populated area, and it's the reason why why during these types of events that the National Weather Service issues tornado emergencies.
Yes. After traveling 80 miles. And encompassing a width of 1.5 miles at its peak, the tornado would eventually dissipate about an hour and a half after it formed. Kind of was almost the perfect storm. It rapidly intensified as it hit Tuscaloosa. It calmed down when it hit the rural areas, and then it exploded in intensity again when it hit Birmingham.
North of Birmingham, yeah.
It feels like the perfect storm to me, honestly. Just this tornado having a mind of its own, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we could ever see something like that again?
Now Birmingham is actually a very common tornado target, in the U.S. It's probably the second most vulnerable city behind Oklahoma City.
All right.
They've seen a lot of violent tornadoes there. It actually got hit by F5 tornadoes in 1977 and 1998.
Ouch.
In the suburbs, outskirts of Birmingham. So definitely they are familiar to tornado outbreaks in that part of the country, but still there's not a lot of, the infrastructure there is still not really prepared for it well. So you had a lot of people in homes that were wood frame, not well built, that were just getting torn apart by this tornado. Yeah. Unlike in Oklahoma, where you have more, the suburbs of OKC that have a history of getting violent tornadoes have actually built homes with hurricane straps to prevent significant damage during tornadoes.
I asked Ethan if he thought we could see another event like we saw in Tuscaloosa in Alabama. This was his response. Could we see it again?
Absolutely. A lot of people seem to think, major cities, metro areas are immune to tornadoes, but as Tuscaloosa-Birmingham proved, it can absolutely happen. Yes. And it has happened before in other cities as well.
The Rainsville-Sylvina tornado was the fourth and final EF5 tornado that occurred on the super outbreak. This tornado would kill 25 people and cost at least $150,000 in damage, because some of the figures are not known.
But this is kind of one of the lesser known tornadoes of this outbreak, because it kind of got overshadowed by Tuscaloosa, Hackleberg, Cordova, all the tornadoes that really leveled a lot of larger towns. So, but this tornado was definitely no joke. This was an EF5 that completely destroyed a small community and at least one school, if I remember correctly. Because I actually saw a photo of a school bus that had been completely stripped down just to the chassis and the wheels. That was it.
The Rainsville tornado would touch down at 6:19 p.m., and after initially being a very narrow 50-yard tornado, the tornado would greatly widen and rapidly intensify into an EF5 monster at a half-mile wide, while completely and utterly destroying Rainsville. It would then move into Sylvina and just completely destroy several buildings, pull up a sidewalk, and level a church. It would then cross to the Georgia border, causing much more damage before dissipating at 6:53 p.m. The tornado would track 36 miles as it was moving through these areas.
From this EF5. Yeah, that was one of the most violent tornadoes of the outbreak. And it mostly impacted, some more rural areas right around kind of the end of the Appalachian Mountains in Alabama, Georgia. That's where it moved through.
As well as strike the small community of Tanner, Alabama, which was hit twice in a single day during the 1974 super outbreak. Just like in 1974, Tanner was once again obliterated with either high-end EF4 or low-end EF5 damage across much of the community. It then crossed into Tennessee and continued its destructive path until eventually dissipating an hour and a half after it touched down. There is evidence that it continued through the mountains due to tree damage associated with the tornado, continuing through much of the hilly areas of Tennessee before dissipating.
A fun fact about Rainsville was none of this is really fun, but it did impact the town of Tanner, Alabama, which was hit in 1974 during the super outbreak by 2 F5 tornadoes in the same day. So this is the third F5 tornado to impact that area.
However, unlike some of the other tornadoes we were talking about, the Rainsville tornado was only an EF5 in a couple of locations, unlike the Hackleberg tornado, which was an EF5 violent tornado almost all the way through its path.
I believe this was one of those ones that was an EF5 in a select area, right through Rainsville.
Okay.
This one, really, it was Hackleberg that was a continuous violent tornado.
The final tornado we will be talking about today was the EF4 tornado that struck Cordova and several other surrounding communities in Alabama and Tennessee. This tornado would stay on the ground for over 2 hours and track almost 128 miles. This tornado would kill 13 people and 54 others were injured.
This is an EF4 180 mile per hour, so one of the the weakest tornado are the ones that we talked about, but still really strong tornado, very long track.
This tornado would touch down around 3:40 p.m. And after causing quite a bit of damage as an EF0 to EF2 tornado, this tornado would rapidly intensify into a half-a-mile wide EF3 tornado as it struck the town of Cordova. After striking Cordova, the tornado intensified further to an EF4 tornado as it moved through northeastern Walker County, and it completely leveled a site-built home and obliterated two nearby mobile homes. One of the mobile home undercarriages was tossed at least 500 yards away. A 5-ton bulldozer was also flipped over, and a pickup truck was tossed 200 yards, and a dump truck tossed 50 yards and completely destroyed. After weakening slightly, the tornado intensified once again to an EF4 strength after weakening to EF3, and destroyed a cinder-block construction home, which was leveled, and a car once again was thrown 130 yards.
Like with an EF4, you'll see homes that aren't well built, not anchored to their foundations, are going to get swept away by an EF4. The real difference is whether they're bolted or not, and what the house is made of. Like if you got like a reinforced concrete house get completely swept off its slab, that was bolted down, that's EF5. But
Yep.
a lot of these homes aren't really, they're wood framed, they might not even be anchored, so they're going to get destroyed and swept away pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we saw a lot with Cordova. This one may have actually been more violent, but we saw a lot of homes that were, it was, a regular, deep south town with wood frame homes that got easily destroyed.
An interesting thing to note is that Cordova actually got hit by an EF1 tornado on the morning of April 27th, when that first round of storms hit. This second tornado was rated an EF3 as it hit Cordova, and it has become known as one small town hit twice by tornadoes on the same day, although to a lesser degree, similar to what happened at Tanner, Alabama in 1974. After hitting Bluntsville at EF3 strength, the tornado would significantly destroy many trees within the area. Eventually, it lifted south-southwest of Guntersville at 5:56 p.m. Central Daylight Time, concluding one of the most destructive tornadoes throughout the outbreak. There is very little to note about April 28th, except for two things. The first, the SPC issued a slight risk from Vermont all the way down to Florida. The second is that it was the remnants of the lines of thunderstorms that devastated much of the Deep South on April 27th.
Because on the 28th, what was left over from the main super outbreak moved further east across the east coast of the U.S., actually stretched all the way up to New York, where it produced several EF2 tornadoes. And by the time we got through the East Coast and the Carolinas, the outbreak was less severe than it had been. It was mostly like a line of strong thunderstorms, but we still had some pretty strong tornadoes embedded within that, especially over the southern Appalachians, where a couple of EF3, EF4 tornadoes formed through Tennessee, Kentucky, out into Virginia. There's actually an EF3 down in southwest Virginia that killed at least one person.
There is no question that the 2011 super outbreak was historic and tragic. Over 300 people were killed and cost over $10 billion in damage. However, I asked Ethan if this super outbreak or if the 1974 super outbreak was worse in his opinion. He actually sees both sides of the coin.
In terms of the overall amount of damage, just because 2011 affected such a huge area and occurred over several days, probably that one in terms of the overall impacts. But if we're talking like a repeat of either event, if we would have a repeat of 1974 today, we'd see so many cities like Cincinnati, Louisville, parts of southern Illinois, Indiana, and even northern Alabama, Mississippi, that are so much more populated today than they were then. Just getting hammered by EF4, EF5 tornadoes. We could see a lot more destruction in those cities, a lot more deaths, assuming, depending on how the warnings played out, how the National Weather Service handled it. But
yeah, you see both sides of the coin, it seems. And when I asked him for any final thoughts and advice, he had something to say.
I would just say, if you know someone or you went through this outbreak, feel free to comment, tell your experience. And I actually personally experienced this outbreak driving back from Florida to Maryland in Virginia on I-95, went through some of the thunderstorms that were left over, and I encountered some pretty damaging winds, lots of rainfall, Obviously, not much compared to what people in the deep south went through. But yeah, that was definitely a pretty interesting outbreak that I somehow managed to experience part of.
Yeah.
And my advice to really anyone is, as always, take those warnings seriously.
All right.
Even if it sounds like it's only a 15% risk, it's only a moderate risk. It really is dangerous stuff. You can never really be too safe.
Yes.
Always have a weather radio handy or some way of getting warnings quickly from the NWS. Before severe weather events happen, find a place to take shelter in your home or somewhere else that's close by.
All right.
Especially interior room, underground, all that. And
Yes.
really just pay attention to it because it can change so quickly. One day, so many towns can be destroyed. So many people's lives can be changed.
The 2011 super outbreak will remain in the minds of many people for many years to come, both for its awesome power of its tornadoes as well as the pure destruction of many, including the EF5 tornadoes, as well as especially the Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado that ravaged through suburb after suburb and hit Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, two of Alabama's biggest cities in the state. And yeah, if you were in this outbreak, if you were affected by this, just remember that we will never forget. And I personally want to say I am sorry you had to go through what you had to go through. Honestly, it's hard to say anything else other than that because of how powerful and how raw the destruction it was. But with that being said, that's going to wrap up this documentary. Before I go, I want to say thank you to a few people. First, I want to thank my friend Ethan, who I was interviewing in this documentary, for helping me get this documentary together, for letting me interview him for this, and for his wonderful knowledge on this super outbreak. I also want to thank PJC Productions, who for a while he had a documentary up on April 27th. He eventually deleted it, but that documentary inspired me to make this two-part series on the 2011 super outbreak. PJC, if you're watching this, I want to say thank you for that. And lastly, I want to thank you for watching this. I want to thank you for everything. I want to thank you for, number one, watching this video, and number two, understanding how powerful these storms were. If you were affected by this, I have really no words to say how sorry I am, and just it's still something I can't even wrap my brain around. But I want to say thank you for watching this. It is much appreciated. And if you are new, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, turn on those notifications, and get more people involved in weather. It is outbreaks like the super outbreak of 2011 that make me want to go on YouTube and report the weather as I do. So I want to say thank you. And with that being said, stay safe.